ex-husband thought he deserved my dad's company until I showed everyone his true colors. I held up my father's journal. These are my father's words. He never wanted you to lead this company. The accountant stood up. I have something to add, he said. Neil has been making unauthorized withdrawals from company funds. I demand his immediate dismissal. The color drained from Neil's face, and I saw fear in his eyes for the first time. Just then, Dylan walked in and projected an image onto the screen. It was a photo of Neil with another woman entering an apartment. You've been using company money for your personal life, Dad, Dylan said calmly. The vice president called for a vote, and every hand in the room went up except Neil's. The room went up except for Neil. He turned to me, his face twisted in anger. I should never have married you, he spat before storming out. I watched him leave, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. The man I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. After the meeting, Dylan approached me. Mom, I want to help. He smiled gently and said, Mom, you've come a long way. I nodded, feeling a sense of we've both found closure. I replied, setting the photo aside. It was time to focus on the future. Despite all the hardship, I was grateful for my mother's strength, my father's wisdom and my son's resilience. The company was thriving, my family was healing and I knew that the best was yet to come. The worst husband may have left, but the best legacy remained and that was more than enough. My husband, Neil, is the COO of the same company. It seems like the company doesn't understand our situation. We've been married for 25 years, and now it feels like I'm living with a stranger. Our 2 sons have moved out and started their careers, and it feels like I'm left here to pick up the pieces. Neil used to be my partner and my confidant, but now he's someone I barely recognize. I wonder if he ever truly cared or if he's always been this cold, and I just didn't see it. A few years ago, my father died suddenly from a heart attack. My mother took over the company, despite her lack of experience. She asked the employees for their support, and they respected her, not because she was a business genius, but because they admired my father's legacy. The vice president, who was Dad's trusted colleague, ran most of the operations. Neil, as ever, was eager to learn and rise in the company. But over time, his ambition turned into something darker. Let me join the company, he said. I hesitated, not wanting him to give up his own dreams. But Dylan smiled. Grandpa built this company. I want to make it. He said, tears filling my eyes, not from sadness but pride. My son was ready to take on the challenge of bringing new ideas and energy into the company. Neil and I divorced soon after, and he struggled to find work. His reputation was ruined by his own actions. He tried to leverage his past connections for a new job, but word of his embezzlement had spread, and no one would associate with him. Eventually, he ended up doing menial jobs just to make ends meet. It was a sad downfall for someone. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was barely scraping by, living in a small apartment isolated from the world. He used to dominate it, but it was hard to reconcile this version of Neil with the man I had once loved. I knew that his choices had led him here. He became obsessed with power, and his ambition started to overshadow everything else. I saw glimpses of his kindness back then, but I ignored the warning signs, thinking it was just the pressure of work after my father died. Neil seemed to think he'd automatically step into the role of president, but my mother never gave him that power. She saw something in him that worried her, a hunger for control that didn't come with the right intentions. Neil's attitude grew colder. He spoke to my mother harshly, as if she was an obstacle in his path, and at work. He started treating the employees badly, asking for more than they could give and firing people for the smallest mistakes. It was as if he'd forgotten what it meant to be part of a team and lead with empathy. My mother's refusal to promote him only made him more resentful, and that resentment affected every aspect of our lives. My mother, even though her memory was slipping, noticed these changes and tried to tell Neil that leading a company was about more than just power. I could see that it could be a game changer for us. I listened as he laid out his plan, impressed by his vision and determination. It was clear that he had inherited my father's entrepreneurial spirit. As we moved forward, I found myself taking on a new role within the company. I wasn't the executive I used to be, but I was a mentor and a guide for the younger generation. I helped Dylan and his team navigate the challenges of running a business, offering advice when needed but also giving them the space to make their own decisions. It was rewarding in a way I hadn't expected. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that I was contributing to something meaningful. Neil, on the other hand, had faded into the background. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was struggling to move from one low-paying job to another. He'd lost everything: his career, his family, his reputation. It was hard to believe that this was the same man I'd once loved and built a life with. He was all about power, but he wouldn't listen at home. When our sons were still around, things were easier. They filled the house with laughter and their presence acted as a buffer between Neil and me. But now that they're gone, Neil and my mother are at odds. His words are harsher, his patience thinner. It's like he blames me for everything that isn't going right in his life. I tried to remind him of the love we once shared, but it felt like I was talking to a wall. Neil would come home late, drunk and angry. One night he stumbled in after midnight. I was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for him. I said, "Neil, we need to talk." I tried to sound calm and not wake my mother upstairs. I wanted to reach him and find some part of the man I had married, but he slumped into a chair and his eyes glazed over. He was talking about Sharon and more complaints about his mother. His dismissive tone cut through me like a knife. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "She's not just my mother, Neil. People change, and sometimes they become someone you no longer recognize." Dylan's wedding was a beautiful affair. He and his fiancée Emily were glowing with happiness as I watched them exchange vows. Despite everything that had happened, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Our family had made it through, and we were stronger for it. My mother was there too, sitting quietly and smiling. She might not have fully understood what was going on, but she knew it was a happy day. After the wedding, Dylan and Emily threw themselves into their work, determined to take the company to new heights. They were a perfect team, balancing each other out and bringing fresh ideas to the table. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome. The company my father built was in good hands, and I knew that his legacy would live on for generations to come. Looking back, I realized that the challenges I faced had shaped me into a stronger person. Even in her moments of confusion, my mother had tried to protect me and the company. I knew I had to act. I called my son Dylan and told him everything. He listened quietly and then said, "Mom, don't worry, we'll handle it together." I knew I could handle this together. Hearing his confidence gave me strength. I realized that I wasn't alone. Dylan was with me, and together we could face whatever came our way. The following week, I called an emergency company meeting. All the employees gathered in the conference room, and Neil sat there with a smug smile, assuming he would finally get what he wanted. I stood up, my mother's proxy in hand, and announced that due to my mother's illness, we needed to appoint a new president. I proposed we make the vice president. I said, "Who has faithfully led us for years?" "The new president." The room erupted in applause, but Neil shot up from his chair shouting, "This is ridiculous. She can't make decisions in her state." His face was red with anger, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. Caring for my mother after Neil left, I found myself alone in caring for my mother. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. I hired a home care nurse to help a few days a week, but most of the burden fell on me. One afternoon, while tidying my mother's room, the nurse found and Sharon handed me an old leather-bound notebook she'd found beside my mother's bed. It was my father's journal. I hadn't seen it in years. I opened it and tears filled my eyes as I read his words. He wrote about his dreams for the company, his worries about Neil, and his hope that the company would stay in safe hands. In one of the last entries, he'd written, "Never let Neil become president." It hit me like a punch in the gut. My father had seen Neil had been on my mother's radar long before I was aware of it. I'd been blind to Neil's true nature for so long, but my father had known. I found a note in my mother's handwriting, "Sharon, I trust you. Stop Neil." My heart sank. One evening, as I sat in my mother's room, she looked at me with a rare moment of clarity. "Sharon," she said softly, "you've done well." I held her hand, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered. In that moment, I knew that all the hard work and pain was worth it in the end. My mom might not remember everything, but she knew deep down that her family was safe and her husband's legacy was secure. Dylan was amazing. He brought in a young programmer who helped us move towards a more digital operation. The company started using advanced software for planning and production, making processes faster and more efficient. We even started experimenting with 3D printing, which I knew nothing about but which fascinated Dylan. He was determined to. Dylan was always keen to bring the company into the future, and I was happy to support him in any way I could. One day, Dylan came to me with a proposal, "Mom, I think we should expand." He was really excited, and he was right, there was a market we hadn't tapped into yet. "She's part of this family, and I need your help. I can't do this alone." I was practically begging, hoping for even a shred of empathy. He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the empty kitchen. "Family, she doesn't even remember who I am half the time. Why should I care?" His words cut deep, but I swallowed my pride because that's what we do, Neil. We look out for each other and we promise to stick together through thick and thin. I could see the anger in his eyes and the frustration on his face as he stood up abruptly, knocking over the chair. "I didn't sign up for this. I'm done, Sharon. I'm moving out." The next morning he was gone. He left a note on the counter, scribbled hastily, "I need space. Don't try to contact me." I sat at I was sitting at the table, looking at the note, feeling a mix of anger and relief. Part of me was devastated, but another part felt lighter. Maybe now, without Neil's constant criticism, I could focus on what really mattered. I had learned to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right, and to protect the people I loved. Neil's betrayal had been painful, but it had also been a catalyst for change. Ultimately, it led to something better. One day, as I was packing away some old things, I came across a photo of Neil and me from our early days together. We looked so happy and full of hope for the future. I felt a pang of sadness for what could have been, but I quickly pushed it aside. Life had taken us down different paths, and I was finally at peace with that. Dylan walked into the room, catching me with the old photo. He smiled gently and said, "You've come a long way." I nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment. I was packing away some old things and came across a photo of Neil and me from our early days together. We looked so happy and full of hope for the future. I felt a pang of sadness for what could have been, but I quickly pushed it aside. Life had taken us down different paths, and I was finally at peace with that. Dylan walked into the room, catching me with the old photo. Meanwhile, Dylan was breathing new life into the company, bringing in new talent and modernizing our approach. He was full of ideas, from updating our technology to creating a more inclusive company culture. One day, he shared some happy news. He was engaged to his college sweetheart, and she was joining our company too. Despite everything, the legacy my father built was safe, and our family was healing. The worst part of my life had given me the best outcome. a son who made me proud every single day. A few months after Dylan took over the company, it started to thrive in ways I hadn't seen in years. Employees were happier, productivity was up, and there was a sense of optimism in the air. Dylan had a natural talent for leadership, which was something Neil never had. If he'd listened to the employees, valued their input and made them feel like they were part of something bigger, it would have been everything my father would have wanted. It would have filled me with a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. My husband stood in the living room, his voice raised in frustration. "Why should I have to take care of your mother? She's practically a stranger to me." Neil yelled. My mother was sitting silently, looking lost. Her dementia was worsening by the day. I took a deep breath, pushing down the hurt. "Fine, Neil. Do what you need to do," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside I knew this was the breaking point. For years, I had tried to hold everything together, our family, our business, and our marriage. Neil's words felt like the last straw. It wasn't just about my mother, it was about the lack of compassion and the coldness that had slowly crept into our relationship. I realized then that I had been trying to save something that was already gone. I'm Sharon. I'm 50 years old. My life has taken a turn. I never imagined I'd leave my job as an executive at the company my father founded to care for my mother, Mary, who is struggling with dementia.